typical morning at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, with students in their crisp white uniforms, walking briskly across the campus, ready for another day of rigorous training. But as the cadets gathered in the courtyard, an unexpected hush fell over the crowd. The sound of boots echoing on the cobblestone street grew louder, and a figure appeared at the entrance, flanked by security personnel. Donald Trump. Of all people, Donald Trump. The crowd went silent. No one had seen it coming. The former president, the controversial businessman, and the polarizing figure of the decade stood at the threshold of one of America's most prestigious military institutions. The air was thick with anticipation and confusion. Why was he here? What did this mean for the future of these future leaders of the United States? Jack Collins, a young cadet who had always dreamed of serving in the Navy, stood frozen in the middle of the crowd. His heart raced as he watched the former president step forward. He had never imagined something like this would happen in his lifetime, let alone at his own academy. His thoughts raced. What's he doing here? What's going to happen next? As the cadets stood in stunned silence, Trump's voice cut through the tension. I'm here to talk about something that matters more than anything else. The future of this great nation and the role all of you will play in it. Jack's mind was swirling. What was the purpose of this visit? Was it an honor? Or was it something more? The question lingered in his mind, unanswered, as Trump's presence took hold of the entire academy, disrupting the regular flow of life in ways no one could have predicted. As the event unfolded, Jack couldn't help but wonder, what would he learn from this? And more importantly, what would this moment mean for his future? Jack Collins had always dreamed of serving in the Navy. Raised in a small town in Ohio, he grew up idolizing soldiers and sailors, inspired by his grandfather's stories of service during World War II. But Jack's journey to the academy hadn't been easy. His parents had always envisioned him going to law school or becoming a doctor, professions that would ensure a comfortable life. But Jack had always felt a calling beyond the conventional career paths. From the moment he set foot on the academy grounds, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. However, the pressure to meet expectations, both from his family and his fellow cadets, often felt overwhelming. His father, a successful businessman, often questioned his decision to join the Navy. Why waste your potential on a military career when you could do so much more? His father had asked more than once. Jack had always brushed off those questions, but deep down, they gnawed at him. Was he truly making the right choice? Was this the life he wanted? Or was he simply trying to prove something to himself? And then there was Mike, his best friend at the academy. Mike had always been the guy who was cool under pressure, the one everyone turned to when they needed advice. Jack and Mike had been inseparable since day one, bonding over late-night talks about their futures and their shared passion for service. Mike often told Jack, "Don't overthink it, man. You're here for a reason. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But even Mike didn't seem entirely sure of what the future held. They were both in the same boat, uncertain about what life after the academy would bring. Jack had always known that the Navy would be his path, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, something that would test not just his beliefs, but his very purpose in life. And now, with Donald Trump making a surprise visit to the academy, he felt like the world was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. The days following Trump's surprise visit to the Naval Academy were filled with a mix of excitement, confusion, and disbelief. The cadets couldn't stop talking about it. Some were inspired by his words, while others were deeply skeptical. Jack, however, found himself caught in the middle. He had always respected the Navy's tradition of discipline and honor, but now there was an unfamiliar sense of unease in the air. That afternoon, the cadets were called to a special assembly. The usual cadet formations were replaced with rows of chairs set up in a large hall. Jack walked in with Mike, both of them wondering what this meeting would bring. As they sat down, Jack noticed a familiar face in the front row: Captain Reynolds, a highly respected but stern officer who had been overseeing Jack's training. Captain Reynolds was a man who never showed emotion, never wavered in his commitment to duty, and made sure every cadet adhered to the rules. Jack admired him, but also feared him. When Captain Reynolds stood up, the room fell silent. His voice was sharp, yet somehow calm. "You all know that this week, we had an unexpected guest. Former President Trump's visit wasn't just for show. He's here to offer his support for a new program that could dramatically change the future of our academy. Some of you might see it as an opportunity. Some of you might see it as a threat. But I'm here to tell you, this will test your resolve. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of what this new program would mean. He had always known the Navy to be about tradition and discipline, but now there were whispers about politics, power plays, and influences beyond the academy's walls. Mike leaned over and whispered, "What do you think this is all about? It doesn't feel right. I mean, why now?" Jack shrugged, feeling the weight of the uncertainty. "I don't know, Mike, but it feels like something big is coming." And that's when Captain Reynolds dropped the bombshell. "We've been chosen to participate in a leadership initiative, spearheaded by Mr. Trump himself. The program will challenge everything we've been taught. The stakes will be higher than ever. But make no mistake, those who succeed will lead the future of the Navy." The room erupted with murmurs. Some cadets exchanged nervous glances, while others leaned forward, eager to know more. Jack couldn't decide whether he was excited or terrified. "I need all of you to understand something," Captain Reynolds continued, his gaze sweeping over the room. "This program will not be easy. The challenges will push you to your limits. You will question your loyalty, your purpose, and your very identity. But if you want to make it in this world, you need to prove that you can stand strong in the face of pressure." Jack's stomach tightened. This wasn't just another training exercise. It was something far more personal. The academy had always been a place of structure, where everything had its place. But now, with Trump's involvement, the very core of what Jack had believed in was being questioned. "Think long and hard about what you're willing to sacrifice," Captain Reynolds warned. "Because this isn't just about leadership. It's about power. It's about influence. And it's about your future." Jack couldn't help but feel conflicted. On the one hand, the challenge appealed to his desire to prove himself. But on the other hand, it felt like something was being taken from him, the purity of what he had always imagined the Navy to be. There were whispers in the back of the room about Trump's political influence and his vision for the future, but Jack didn't know where he stood yet. His mind was spinning with questions. What was this program really about? Would it change everything he'd worked for? Or would it push him to become the leader he'd always hoped to be? Later that evening, as Jack sat in his room, he could hear Mike pacing back and forth in the hallway outside. Finally, Jack opened the door. "Dude, we need to talk," Mike said, his voice full of frustration. Jack stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. "What's going on?" Mike ran a hand through his hair. "I can't shake this feeling. This whole thing with Trump, the leadership program, it feels like they're trying to control us. Like it's all just a game to them." Jack leaned against the wall. "I don't know, Mike. I get it. But it's also an opportunity. We've worked so hard to get here. Maybe we can use this to our advantage. Prove that we're not just following orders, but making a real impact." Mike shook his head. "It's not that simple, Jack. There's more at play here. It's about power, Trump's power. And we don't even know what it'll cost us." Jack was torn. He had always wanted to lead, to make a difference. But was this the right path? Was it worth the risk? "Look, I don't know what this is going to turn into," Jack said, "but we can't let fear control us. We have to take this on, one step at a time. We're in this together, right?" Mike sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Yeah, I guess we are." The conversation left Jack feeling more uncertain than ever. The pressure was mounting. The stakes were rising. And the path ahead was murky. But there was one thing Jack knew for sure. This was just the beginning. The following days were a blur of uncertainty and excitement. The cadets who had been chosen for the new leadership initiative found themselves thrust into a high-pressure environment unlike anything they had experienced before. The usual drills and lessons were replaced with secretive meetings, strategic exercises, and intense evaluations. Jack and Mike, now more than ever, felt like they were walking through a fog, unsure of what lay ahead but determined to press forward. It all began with a mysterious email late one night, sent by none other than Captain Reynolds himself. The subject line simply read, "Mission briefing, tomorrow morning at 0600. Be prepared." Jack stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He glanced over at Mike, who was pacing again, as if he couldn't sit still long enough to focus on anything. "Is this it?" Jack asked, voice barely a whisper. Mike ran a hand through his hair. I don't know. But we've been chosen, Jack. This isn't just some random assignment. Something big is coming. I can feel it. Jack nodded, his stomach twisting. He had felt the same way, but what did this mean for their future? Were they about to be molded into something they didn't recognize? Something they weren't ready for? The next morning, the cadets were assembled in the large briefing room, standing at attention in front of a massive screen. The tension in the air was palpable. Every single person in the room could sense that they were on the brink of something that would define their futures. Captain Reynolds stood at the front, his face as impassive as ever. You've all been selected because you've demonstrated leadership potential, but this will test you in ways you can't even imagine. We are entering a new phase of your training, one that is not just about following orders. It's about innovation, influence, strategy, and most importantly, how you respond when your very identity is challenged. Jack swallowed hard, a cold chill running down his spine. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He had come here to serve, to honor the Navy's values, not to play some political game. But as the briefing continued, Jack realized this was no longer about his personal beliefs. This was bigger than him, bigger than all of them. This morning, you will be split into teams, Captain Reynolds continued. Each team will be assigned a mission. You will have 72 hours to complete it. The stakes are high, and the pressure will be intense. Fail, and you'll be eliminated from this program. Succeed, and you will be among the Navy's most elite leaders. The screen flickered, and a new image appeared. It was a map highlighting a series of complex terrain features, mountains, rivers, forests. Jack's mind raced. This wasn't just a theoretical challenge. This was real. The cadets would be sent into the wilderness to test their leadership, teamwork, and ability to make life-or-death decisions. Jack felt his pulse quicken. He had trained for this, but something about the way Captain Reynolds spoke made the stakes seem far more personal than they had ever been. This wasn't just a test of physical endurance. This was about everything they had learned, everything they believed. Remember, Captain Reynolds said, his voice steady and unyielding, you are being watched. Your decisions will be scrutinized. This is no longer just about your skills. It's about how you handle pressure when the world is watching. Do not fail. The room was silent as the briefing ended. Jack exchanged a glance with Mike, who didn't look as confident as usual. There was no turning back now. The challenge was set, and they would have to face it head-on. The cadets were quickly split into teams, each assigned a different sector of the wilderness to navigate. Jack and Mike found themselves together, naturally. They had always been a solid team, their skills complementing each other. Mike's ability to think on his feet, his coolness under pressure, paired perfectly with Jack's steady resolve and focus. Together, they felt they could take on anything. But this time, something was different. Jack noticed Mike's anxiety was getting the best of him, his usually calm demeanor cracked by the weight of the situation. Are you okay? Jack asked as they loaded their gear into a transport vehicle. Mike didn't meet his eyes. I don't know. I don't trust this, Jack. Something about the way this whole thing is set up. It's like they're playing a game with us. We're not supposed to just be soldiers anymore. We're supposed to be pawns in someone's larger scheme. Jack tried to offer reassurance, but part of him couldn't shake the feeling that Mike was right. This wasn't the Navy he had imagined. This was something else entirely. As the vehicle rumbled toward their designated starting point, Jack looked out the window, the dense forest stretching out before him. The challenges ahead would test every ounce of their training. And with Trump's program looming over them, they had no idea what the ultimate goal was, or what they would become in the process. When the vehicle finally stopped, the cadets were given their first task: map out their route, make decisions about resource allocation, and devise a strategy to reach their final destination before time ran out. The clock was ticking, and the pressure was mounting. As Jack, Mike, and their teams set out into the wilderness, they quickly realized that this was no ordinary training exercise. The terrain was harsh, the conditions unforgiving, and every choice they made could lead to victory or failure. Jack's mind was spinning. Could they navigate the treacherous path ahead? Could they stay true to their values? Or would they be forced to compromise everything they stood for in the name of survival? And most importantly, what would happen if they failed? The wilderness was relentless. The dense forest stretched endlessly before Jack, Mike, and their team as they navigated the unforgiving terrain. Every step seemed harder than the last, with the weight of their gear pressing down on their shoulders and the oppressive silence of the forest enveloping them. The clock was ticking, and they had no time to waste. The goal was clear. They needed to reach the designated point before the time ran out. But every obstacle they encountered seemed to push them further from their objective. Jack could feel the tension growing between him and Mike. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that was taking its toll, but something deeper, something unspoken. Mike had been quiet for hours now, his usual confidence replaced by a palpable unease. "Mike, you good?" Jack asked, trying to break the silence. Mike didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed ahead, but Jack could see the flicker of doubt in his friend's gaze. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice strained. "I don't know, man. I don't know if I can keep doing this." Jack's heart sank. He had never seen Mike like this before, vulnerable, questioning everything they had worked for. It wasn't just the physical strain that was getting to him. It was the weight of the program, the manipulation they both felt but couldn't put into words. "I thought we were in this together," Jack said quietly, trying to keep his own voice steady. "We've made it this far, Mike. We can't back down now." But Mike shook his head, the frustration clear in his movements. "It's not about backing down, Jack. It's about whether this is even worth it. We've been put in a position where it feels like we're just pawns in someone's game. I don't know who's pulling the strings, but I'm starting to think it's not the kind of leadership I signed up for." Jack could feel his own anger bubbling up. The pressure of the situation, the weight of the program, the way it was all starting to feel like a setup. It was all becoming too much. He had joined the academy to serve, to lead with honor. But now, it felt like that sense of purpose was slipping away, replaced by an uncomfortable truth he wasn't ready to face. "Mike, I get it. I feel the same way, but we can't let it break us. We have to finish what we started," Jack said, trying to sound resolute. But Mike's eyes were clouded with doubt. "I don't know if I can, Jack. Maybe we're not supposed to win this. Maybe we're not supposed to be leaders anymore." Just then, a loud crack echoed through the trees, cutting the tension like a knife. Jack spun around, instinctively reaching for his weapon. The forest had been eerily quiet for hours, and the sudden sound made his heart race. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. 3 figures emerging from the shadows, wearing the same gear as the cadets but with a different, more aggressive air about them. "Who's there?" His voice low but commanding. The figures stopped, and one of them stepped forward. It was a cadet from a rival team, a tall, broad-shouldered guy named Brian, who had always seemed to have a bit of a chip on his shoulder. "Brian," Jack said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "What are you doing out here?" Brian smirked, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and challenge. "Same thing you are, Collins. Trying to win, trying to prove something. But you're not going to make it. Not if I have anything to say about it." Mike tensed beside Jack, ready for anything. "What do you mean? This is about completing the mission, not fighting each other." But Brian wasn't listening. "That's the thing you don't get, Collins. It's not just about completing the mission. It's about playing the game. And if you don't know how to play, you're already lost." With that, Brian and his team turned, disappearing into the trees as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Jack and Mike standing in stunned silence. The encounter shook Jack to his core. It was one thing to face the wilderness, to face the physical challenge of the mission, but now it was clear. There were forces at play here that were far beyond their control. This wasn't just about leadership. It was about power, influence, and who could survive the game. Mike's voice broke the silence. "Did you hear that? Did you hear what he said? We're not just fighting the terrain. We're fighting each other. We're fighting for something we don't even understand." Jack was quiet for a long moment, trying to process everything. Brian's words echoed in his mind. Was this really about leadership? Or was it all just manipulation? A game where only the most ruthless would win? "I don't know anymore, Mike," Jack admitted. "I really don't know." For the first time, Jack felt completely lost. His purpose, his beliefs, everything he had worked for seemed to be unraveling. The values that had always defined him, the honor, the duty, seemed to be fading in the face of something much darker. But then, a thought hit him. It wasn't over yet. They still had a mission to complete. They couldn't give up now, no matter how twisted this game had become. They still had to fight. "We're not done yet," Jack said, his voice firm despite the doubt that lingered in his chest. "We finished this, Mike. We finished this for ourselves, not for anyone else. Not for Trump, not for anyone." Mike nodded, though he still looked uncertain. But Jack could see the flicker of resolve in his eyes. They weren't alone in this anymore. They had each other. And if they could hold on to that, maybe they could make it through. But as they pushed forward, the weight of the program and the unknown consequences of failure loomed large. Every step was more uncertain than the last. And Jack knew that whatever came next would change everything. The sun was setting behind the towering trees, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The air was thick with tension as Jack and Mike trudged forward, their bodies aching, their minds weighed down by the events of the day. They had been pushed to their limits, physically and emotionally, and now the clock was ticking. The finish line was in sight, but there was something heavier than the mission itself pressing down on them: the truth. Jack's thoughts drifted back to Brian's words. It's not just about completing the mission. It's about playing the game. He had tried to push them aside, tried to focus on the task at hand. But the more he thought about it, the more those words seemed to ring true. What had started as a simple test of leadership had morphed into something far more complicated. Was this truly about leading with integrity, or was it about power? And if it was about power, what did that mean for his place in the Navy? For his values? Mike had been quieter than ever since their encounter with Brian. Jack could see the unease in his eyes, the same unease that had been present ever since the start of this program. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion anymore. It was the weight of what they were learning, of what they were becoming. Jack could feel the distance growing between them, and it made him uneasy. "Mike," Jack said, breaking the silence, "we're almost there. We've got this." Mike didn't respond right away. He kept his eyes on the ground, his shoulders slumped. Finally, he looked up, and Jack could see the resignation in his friend's eyes. "I don't know, man. I don't know if we do." Mike's voice was low, almost a whisper. "I thought this was going to be about something bigger, about serving with honor, about leading with integrity. But I don't know what any of this is anymore. I thought I knew who I was, but now, I'm not so sure." Jack felt the weight of Mike's words settle on his chest like a heavy stone. He had been thinking the same thing. The ideals that had drawn him to the Navy, the principles he had believed in, were slowly being chipped away by the reality of this program. It was like they were being pushed into a world where only the strongest, the most ruthless, survived. And that wasn't the world Jack had imagined. "I get it," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been feeling the same way. This isn't what I thought it was. But we're here, Mike. We can't go back now. We've made it this far. And maybe that's enough." Mike looked at Jack, his face torn. "Maybe it is. But I don't think this is about us anymore. I think this is about something bigger. About how we hold on to ourselves when everything around us is changing." Jack nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the realization. He had been so focused on completing the mission, on proving himself, that he had lost sight of the one thing that truly mattered: his integrity. In this quest to prove his worth, he had allowed himself to be pulled into a game he wasn't sure he even wanted to play. Maybe it's about finding out who we are, even when the world is trying to tell us something different, Jack said quietly. Maybe it's about holding on to the parts of ourselves that matter. Mike was silent for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, maybe you're right." As they continued on their journey, the final stretch of their mission before the finish line, the weight of the situation began to feel a little less suffocating. Jack knew the road ahead was still full of obstacles. There was still uncertainty, still the looming pressure of the program's unknown intentions. But for the first time in what felt like ages, he allowed himself to feel a sense of clarity. The journey had forced him to confront his deepest fears and doubts, but it had also brought him back to the core of who he was. He didn't need to play the game. He didn't need to become something he wasn't. He could lead on his own terms. When they finally reached the designated point, the others were already there, including Brian and his team. The rivalry that had simmered between them now felt almost meaningless, like a distant memory. They were all in the same place, and now the only thing left to do was wait. Captain Reynolds appeared shortly after, his face still as stoic as ever. "Congratulations," he said, his voice clipped. "You've completed the mission." But this was never just about completing an exercise. It was about discovering who you are as a leader. And now, you'll have to decide what kind of leader you want to be. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jack realized that the mission was never really about winning. It was about how they had handled the pressure, how they had stayed true to their values in the face of manipulation, rivalry, and doubt. As the cadets stood in a circle, reflecting on the experience, Jack glanced over at Mike. For the first time in days, Mike smiled, a small but genuine smile. He had come through this, just like Jack had. They hadn't just survived. They had learned something about themselves. For Jack, the experience had been a turning point. He had come into this program thinking it was about proving his worth, about surviving in a world that valued power and influence above all else. But now, he understood. It wasn't about any of that. It was about staying true to who you were, even when everything around you was trying to change you. Captain Reynolds approached them, his gaze intense. "You did well," he said quietly. "But remember, what you've learned here will follow you for the rest of your careers. Leadership is about more than making decisions. It's about making the right decisions, even when the cost is high. Never forget that." Jack looked at Captain Reynolds, a newfound sense of respect building inside him. This wasn't just about surviving the program. It was about understanding the real meaning of leadership, the courage to act with integrity, even when the world around you is falling apart. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack and Mike stood side by side, their bodies tired but their minds clearer than ever. They had made it through the storm, and in the end, they had found something far more valuable than victory. They had found themselves. The days following the conclusion of the mission felt strangely surreal. As the initial adrenaline of the challenge faded, Jack found himself grappling with a sense of quiet reflection that he hadn't anticipated. The adrenaline-fueled chaos of the wilderness was gone, and in its place was a stark, quiet reality. The Naval Academy, with its polished halls and disciplined routine, felt almost distant now, like a world they had left behind. But Jack and Mike both knew that what had transpired in the wilderness, what they had learned about themselves and each other, would stay with them for the rest of their careers. As the cadets gathered back in the barracks, there was an unspoken tension in the air. They had all faced something extraordinary together, something that tested their limits in ways none of them had expected. But now, with the mission over, the reality of the aftermath began to settle in. The camaraderie, the friendships, and the competitive rivalries. Everything had shifted. Jack and Mike sat on their bunks, both of them staring at the floor, each lost in thought. The noise and chatter of their fellow cadets faded into the background. There was something heavy about this moment, something that felt like the calm before a storm. "We made it through, didn't we?" Mike finally spoke, breaking the silence between them. Jack looked up, meeting Mike's gaze. "Yeah, we did. But I can't shake this feeling, Mike. It's like we were just pawns in someone's game. I thought we were there to learn how to lead, how to serve. But in the end, I'm not sure it was ever about that." Mike's expression was unreadable. "You're not the only one who feels that way. But maybe that's what leadership is, Jack. Maybe it's about surviving the game, even when you don't agree with the rules." Jack mulled over Mike's words, feeling the weight of them sink in. He had always believed leadership was about doing the right thing, about leading with integrity. But now, after everything they had been through, he realized that it wasn't always that simple. The world of leadership was messy, unpredictable, and often compromised. As if on cue, Captain Reynolds entered the barracks, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "I know you're all tired, and you've earned your rest. But there's something important we need to discuss. Your final evaluations will be held tomorrow. This isn't just about how you did in the field. It's about what you learned and how you apply it moving forward." There was an uneasy murmur among the cadets. They had all been through the grind, had faced their own personal battles during the mission. But the real challenge, Jack realized, was what came next. What would they do with the lessons they had learned? Would they let this experience shape them into the leaders they had hoped to become? Or would it turn them into something they didn't recognize? Captain Reynolds paused before continuing, his voice low and measured. This is your moment to decide what kind of leader you will be. You've all seen the pressure, the manipulations, the sacrifices. Now, it's up to you to decide whether you will rise above it or be swallowed by it. As the captain's words echoed through the room, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of them. The mission was over, but the true test had only just begun. He was about to be evaluated, not just for his performance, but for his ability to carry the lessons of this experience into the future. Later that evening, Jack found himself in a quiet corner of the barracks, writing in his journal. It had become a routine for him in recent years, a way to process everything that had happened. Tonight, though, his thoughts felt different, more complex. He wasn't just writing about the mission, he was writing about himself, about who he had been before and who he was becoming. Leadership is about more than just what you do on the battlefield. It's about the choices you make when no one is looking. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. But it's also about knowing when to bend and when to break. This mission taught me that much, even if it didn't teach me everything I thought I needed to know. The real test is what comes next. As Jack closed the journal, he felt a sense of quiet resolve settle over him. There was still a long road ahead, and he didn't have all the answers. But one thing was clear. The man he was becoming was not the man he thought he was when he first stepped into the Naval Academy. He had been pushed, tested, and forced to confront the deepest parts of himself, and he was stronger for it. The next day, the cadets filed into the main hall for their final evaluations. The air was thick with anticipation. Jack and Mike stood side by side, feeling the weight of the moment. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew this. Whatever came next, they were ready to face it. When it was Jack's turn to step forward, Captain Reynolds locked eyes with him, a look of silent understanding passing between them. The captain didn't need to say a word. Jack knew that his evaluation wasn't about the results of the mission. It was about how he had handled the process, how he had managed the pressure, how he had kept his integrity intact in a world that often tested it. After a few moments, Captain Reynolds spoke, his voice steady and firm. "Collins, you've shown potential, but potential alone isn't enough. Leadership is about knowing when to push forward and when to pull back. It's about understanding that sometimes you'll be asked to make impossible choices. The key is knowing who you are when it's all over." Jack nodded, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. He hadn't been perfect, but he had learned and he had grown, and that was enough. As he walked out of the hall, Jack glanced over at Mike. They exchanged a brief look, one that spoke volumes, of understanding, of camaraderie, of the journey they had been through together. "We made it," Mike said quietly. Jack smiled. "Yeah, we did." But even as the words left his lips, Jack knew that the Real journey was just beginning. They had come through the trial, but the path ahead would be even more challenging. And yet, he felt ready for whatever was to come. The cool morning air hit Jack's face as he stood outside the academy gates, watching the sun rise over the horizon. The world seemed a little quieter now, as if it too were reflecting on the mission that had just ended. He had spent so many days battling the wilderness, fighting his own doubts, and pushing himself beyond his limits. But now, as the academy's imposing gates stood before him, Jack felt a deep sense of change. This wasn't the same person who had walked into this challenge a few weeks ago. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion, though that was still very much present. It was the mental transformation, the mission, the competition, the tests. It had all been more than just a rite of passage. It had been a mirror that had reflected back everything Jack had been avoiding about himself, his beliefs, and what kind of leader he wanted to become. Mike walked up beside him, still looking a little worn, but there was something different about him now, too. He wasn't the same guy who had stumbled through the mission, questioning everything. He had found a kind of peace in the chaos, just like Jack. "You ever think about how much we've changed?" Mike asked, his voice soft as he gazed at the horizon. Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Every single day. I've learned more about myself these past few weeks than I have in years. And not all of it was easy to accept." Mike chuckled. "Yeah, I hear that. But that's the thing, right? You think you have everything figured out, but then you hit these moments that make you realize you don't know a damn thing. Jack laughed quietly. It felt good to laugh again, to feel like they were moving past the fog of doubt that had clouded their minds for so long. For the first time, Jack allowed himself to truly consider what came next. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. They had faced the trial, learned hard lessons about leadership, power, and integrity, and now it was time to apply those lessons to the world beyond the academy's walls. He could still hear Captain Reynolds' words from the evaluation. Leadership is about knowing who you are when it's all over. The mission had taught him that lesson more than anything. It wasn't about surviving a challenge. It was about what you did afterward, how you moved forward, how you grew, and how you led others. Jack had a clearer picture of what leadership meant now. It wasn't about winning or being the strongest. It wasn't about playing the game by someone else's rules. It was about staying true to who you were, acting with integrity, and leading with the courage to make the right choices, even when the consequences were uncertain. As Jack and Mike stood there, side by side, the sound of footsteps approaching broke their moment of quiet reflection. It was Captain Reynolds, his eyes studying them carefully. "You two look like you've learned something," Captain Reynolds remarked, a faint hint of approval in his voice. Jack straightened, his posture firm. "I think we've learned a lot. But more than anything, we've learned that leadership is about more than just doing what's expected. It's about staying true to who we are, even when things get tough." Captain Reynolds nodded. "That's the right answer. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. It only begins. The real challenges start now, and how you handle them will define the rest of your careers." Mike looked over at Jack, a knowing look passing between them. They were ready. Whatever came next, they were ready to face it together. "I think we're ready for it, sir," Jack said, his voice steady, despite the uncertainty that still lingered in the back of his mind. He wasn't sure what the future held. No one could be. But he did know one thing. He had changed, and with that change came a new kind of strength. Captain Reynolds gave them a small, approving nod. "Good. That's the attitude I like to see. I'll be watching both of you. You've got potential. Don't let it go to waste." As Captain Reynolds turned and walked away, Jack turned to Mike. They exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. They had been through hell and back, but they had come out stronger on the other side. They had learned that leadership wasn't about perfect decisions or smooth paths. It was about growth, resilience, and staying true to your values. And as they walked away from the gates of the academy, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement stirring in his chest. This was only the beginning. The buzz of excitement in the air was palpable. Graduation was on the horizon, and the tension among the cadets had shifted. What had once been a competition for survival in the wilderness now morphed into a collective anticipation of the unknown. The final days at the Naval Academy were fast approaching, and with them, the reality of what lay ahead. The past few weeks had altered Jack and Mike in ways neither could have anticipated, but the time had come to face their future. Jack sat in the academy's mess hall, a mug of coffee in hand, staring out of the window at the sprawling grounds. The noise around him seemed distant as his thoughts swirled, taking him back to the final moments of the mission. He and Mike had made it through the chaos, found clarity, and, most importantly, figured out what kind of leaders they wanted to be. But now, with the real world closing in on them, Jack felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Mike slid into the seat across from him, a look of quiet determination on his face. He had always been the more easygoing of the two, but there was something different about him now, something deeper, more resolved. He had found his own understanding of leadership, just as Jack had, and it was clear that their paths moving forward would be shaped by everything they had learned. "You ever wonder what happens after all this?" Mike asked, setting down his tray with a sigh. Jack smiled faintly. "All the time. It's easy to get lost in the grind, in the next test, the next challenge. But the truth is, we've already been through the hardest part." Mike raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "The hardest part?" "Yeah," Jack replied, leaning back in his chair. "The hardest part wasn't surviving the mission. It was surviving ourselves. It was getting through the doubts, the pressures, the constant pull between who we are and who the world wants us to be. The hardest part was figuring out what kind of people we wanted to become in the end." Mike was silent for a moment, considering Jack's words. "I never thought of it like that," he said finally. "But I get it. I feel like we're more than just graduates at this point. We've learned something real, something that's going to stick with us." Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the window again. "We have. And the real test is what we do with it. It's not about being perfect. It's about being the kind of leaders who can stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The words lingered between them, settling into the air like a promise. The future wasn't going to be easy. They both knew that. But with everything they had learned about themselves, about leadership, and about sacrifice, Jack felt ready to face whatever came next. The world beyond the academy was vast and unpredictable, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was determined to face it with the same resolve he had found within himself during the mission. Graduation day arrived with the kind of fanfare that only the Naval Academy could provide. The entire campus was filled with pride, with families gathered to watch their loved ones take the next step toward their futures. As Jack stood in line with his fellow cadets, his heart was beating steadily in his chest, but there was no anxiety now, only a quiet sense of peace. He had earned this moment, and he had earned it not just through hard work or skill, but through growth, through the challenges he had faced, and through the choices he had made. He wasn't the same man who had walked through those academy gates months ago. Mike stood beside him, his usual grin spreading across his face. "Can't believe it's finally here, huh?" Jack chuckled, the familiar camaraderie between them grounding him in the present. "Yeah, it's crazy, but it's also just the start." The ceremony began, and Jack found himself listening to the speeches with a new understanding. They weren't just words anymore. They were reminders of everything they had worked for.